Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Switch Statement Podcast. It's a podcast for investigations into miscellaneous tech topics.
This is episode 4 in our series on the art of game design by Jesse Schell.
Hey, John.
Oh, hey, Matt. How are you?
I'm feeling a little lightheaded. I'm feeling I'm intoxicated with the recording.
Yeah, no, it's been a while since we have recorded, which is something the listeners would not be aware of at all, but to us,
they would not.
Causes all sorts of issues.
I feel like these chapters rather, of the art of game design. You know, I said in a previous episode, maybe 2 episodes back, that my fluff alarms were going off, and man, he has completely done a full 180.
Yeah,
this was intense.
It's all content.
All content, deep technical. I think I want to print these chapters out and on a wall or post their content summarized somewhere, because I feel like it's just so valuable.
Yeah, these were good stuff. He had like 7 pages on brainstorming and like different techniques of brainstorming, which I thought was great.
And just to call it out, so our last episode, technically we were supposed to cover chapter 7, and we talked about the juggler, which I don't want to undersell the value of the juggler story, because it was a good
it's a good anecdote,
kind of parable, but I think that we didn't get to the meat of it. As you were saying, he has many tips about how to brainstorm, none of which we talked about in last episode. So I think we're going to cover that, and then we will also cover episode 8, or chapter 8. Man, I am struggling with the words episode and chapter today.
Yeah, speaking is hard. So the name of chapter 7 is "The Game Begins with an Idea," which, you know, that just tells you right there that this is going to be a substantial chapter. And
does it?
I think so. Well, because as you were pointing out, like all the previous chapters were, you know, I felt like kind of beating around the bush a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of good information in those chapters. But this is the chapter where he's like, this is the beginning of the game. You got an idea. How do you come up with this idea? How do you validate the idea? He talked a lot about like problem statements, which in our industry, we're both software engineers. We discuss problem statements all the time. So I thought that was very interesting. And there was a bunch of new lenses introduced. The first of which that I have written down is the lens of infinite inspiration. Do you recall this lens?
We did touch on this in the last episode, infinite inspiration, and you know we talked about the juggler, right? And just to reiterate, the idea is you shouldn't just be looking at games to find inspiration. If you're designing a game, sure, there is a lot of good inspiration to get from those games, but you should be looking at, I don't know, observing the way animals interact. You should look at a juggler, and preferably look at a juggler who hasn't been looking at other jugglers.
Yeah, this is where, I don't know, I've always thought it's so important to be like a well-rounded individual. Like, I think in our industry, what I've noticed is people go really hard into tech, and that's great. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's so important to like branch out a little bit, read some crazy literature or something that's sort of outside of your wheelhouse, and maybe watch some TV shows that you wouldn't normally watch. And I don't know, to me, like I definitely, especially in the past when I was younger and I really wanted to get into like reading, you know, harder material, I feel like that stuff still informs my life today. And so I don't know, part of how I read this infinite inspiration thing is you need to make sure that you're getting out and really broadening your horizons and experiencing different things. And that's really going to feed back into your like good game design ideas.
Have you ever seen the movie Slumdog Millionaire?
Yeah. It's a solid movie.
It's so funny because it was one of those movies that was massive at the time for like 6 months or something.
Yeah,
and then I feel like no one has talked about it since.
Yep.
But I actually think about it like that movie, because you see there's all these completely incidental experiences through this guy's life about why he knows that Benjamin Franklin is not one of the presidents or something. And I kind of view it the same way, where it's like you never know why or when one of these previous experiences is going to come up and be useful in a completely different context that you would never understand. And so,
dude, I love this deep cut example of this. It's an amazing example.
And now me watching Slumdog Millionaire has now been very valuable that, you know, to this podcast.
You have just improved the quality of this podcast with your random cultural consumption.
And no, I'll tell you this right now. No podcast guide in the world is telling you to go watch Slumdog Millionaire to become a better podcaster. But look at me now. Here I am.
Dude, this is where you're getting the real insight, people. The Switch Statement Podcast.
Yeah, this is how you learn how to make a podcast. Watch Slumdog Millionaire. But yeah, so I 100% agree, and I try to just go in random tangents.
Yeah,
and like look into this stuff, and I think it's, you know, we're better people and better engineers for it.
I feel like specialization is just such a big part of life today, where at least I feel a ton of pressure to just get better at the tiny little purview that I'm already pretty decent at. But yeah, just really important to branch out. So stating the problem, this section I thought was super interesting, just because we deal so much with problem statements. I mean, whenever we're solving some big problem in engineering, literally the first step is to state what the problem actually is, which is often a very, very difficult step. Especially, you know, at my work, I've been working on a large architecture project, and calling out what the actual problem is with a, you know, quote unquote flawed architecture, very, very difficult. You need to get the right numbers. You need to truly understand the pain that engineers are experiencing working on the project. And so it's not just a simple matter of being like, oh, we got a bad architecture. Like, you really need to, you know, do your homework and fully grasp the problem. And I think the same thing is true for a lot of games, you know, stating the problem statement.
The one thing I was going to say is it can be really easy to come up with ways that a design is bad in the abstract. And I think a problem that I can fall into is that you identify this abstract problem, but you miss the step of tying that back to any sort of real world benefit that it's going to confer upon your users.
Yeah.
Right. And so you can spend and through in a particular context, yes, this would be really good work to do. But if you ignore the greater context, you can wind up spending a lot of time fixing problems that don't actually map onto things that your users care about, or that's actually going to help the engineering org or what have you.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And I think the same thing is so true with games, where you can define a problem statement that just kind of misses the point. I was actually trying to define problem statements of games that I love, and it was an interesting exercise because I would often come up with things that don't seem to be that related to the game. Like, I'll use an example of Super Metroid, which I don't know how familiar people are with that game, but Super Metroid, it's an old game where, you know, you land on this planet. It's very mysterious. It's a platforming game, pretty difficult game where the skill ceiling is fairly high, so you need to play the game to like learn all the skills. But when I tried to define a problem statement for that game, I came up with, how can I capture the indescribable weirdness of exploration, of space exploration? Which, it's funny because I went through a bunch of iterations of like, you know, things that were more tied to the gameplay, like, you know, how can I create a platformer that has like gates that you unlock? You know, that's a big thing in Metroid, where you get a new item and it allows you to reach new places. But as I went through this iterative process, my problem statement sort of got trimmed down more and more and became almost more vague. And I thought that was interesting. How can I capture the indescribable weirdness of space exploration?
Yeah, I mean that sounds like you did the process of game design backwards, basically.
Yeah.
Where that may be what they started with. Maybe they were like, yeah, we want to describe the feeling of isolation and excitement and danger about exploring an alien planet.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
And so one of the things that I'll say here is it's kind of interesting. I feel like to take a step back, the idea of framing game design as a problem is kind of interesting to me because it's like the problem is someone doesn't have a game. It's kind of like a silly, and that's kind of reductive, but thinking about game design as solving a problem, yeah, it just feels like a little bit backwards because okay, maybe this is how I'll think about it is game design. Like if I think of problem solving as taking a negative and then
Yeah.
bringing it to zero, right? Whereas I think of game design as taking something from zero and bringing it to a positive. I think that's kind of maybe what feels a little bit out of sorts here.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, which is why I love this section. I just thought it was a new way of thinking about it. It's almost making the argument that there's all these helpful apps on the App Store or Play Store, for instance. It'll be like a weightlifting app or something where 20 minutes a day you just do your weightlifting, and it's kind of like it's taking a hole in your life and it's filling that hole, or that's the purpose ostensibly. And it's almost making the argument that games are the same thing. It's like it's taking this hole that the designer defines or the designer understands is a hole in people's lives. Like, oh, people really want this, epic adventuring thing. And then they make Elden Ring. And it's, I don't know, it's an interesting way of looking at it. Because I definitely looked at it the same way as you're talking about, where games are just this like, you're taking a neutral and you're kind of adding positivity to it. But yeah, maybe there is holes in our lives that can be filled with games.
What did you think about his section about having a silent partner and sleeping and all these things about...
Well, I love this section. Like, there's a thing that used to happen to me all the time in music where I would be... Like, I grew up playing piano, and I would be working on a section for like an hour while I was practicing and just not getting it at all. And then I would go to sleep, wake up the next morning, and just literally play it perfectly, like the first time I tried. And it doesn't happen to me nearly as much anymore, maybe because I'm older and my brain doesn't work as well. But I really do think that like sleep makes all these connections that you kind of can't make in your waking life. And so I absolutely love this section. I thought this is something that I've always found is so important is during the day, you work, you do your best, but there's a point in the day where, you kind of call it a day. You sort of give up for the day and you depend on that, like, sleeping self to solve these problems that you're still struggling with. And that has helped me a lot.
This is what I've heard recently is that sleeping is mostly for your brain, right? It's not, obviously you can get tired and your body needs to recharge. But first and foremost, it's having effects in your brain, and it's cleaning things out, like literally, and also kind of sorting some of the stuff that has happened throughout the day. And it is funny. I mean, I think to tie this back to the earlier section, I think this is a place when these connections, all these things are kind of flying around, getting reorganized. And then maybe this is where these two things can get connected in a way that maybe you wouldn't ordinarily. And that's maybe why when Salvador Dali is falling asleep with a key in his hand, at the point at which he loses muscle function is when he has these amazing insights.
I thought that was super interesting that just in that like fraction of a second or maybe a few seconds between when the key leaves his hand and hits the pan or whatever, that's all that he needs. I found that really fascinating and maybe something to experiment with.
It's interesting. I think that they're kind of two different mechanisms, where one is what you're describing is kind of this process of reiteration or solidifying of knowledge that you had during your day. But that 1 second of sleep is more like a spark.
Yeah.
And they have different functions. Both are important and both relate to your subconscious, but I think that they're kind of different mechanisms.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that that little spark is probably more, Dolly's whole entire career was just like pure innovation, and obviously he was a great implementation expert as well, but I think all of his most important work is probably based on these like extreme innovations that no one else was even close to touching on. And my whole career has very much been in the opposite realm of like implementation, where I'm barely ever innovating. There's like product managers and stuff steering a product, and maybe it's just two different forms of feeding your brain to be able to perform the duties that you need to perform.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I thought the section about Stephen King's muse was hilarious. I don't really have anything to add to this, but Stephen King described his muse as this like gross dude in his basement that just grunts. I found that pretty amazing. It also like makes perfect sense, just having read some Stephen King stuff. Like you can really hear that gross dude in his basement grunting in his work.
It's funny because what is his relationship to that muse? Like a muse in general is supposed to be where you're deriving inspiration from, or a place that you're deriving inspiration from. Is that right? Or
yeah, that's how I take a muse. It's this beautiful, generally speaking, it's like a beautiful woman that you're writing music for or something, if you're a dude.
So then is he trying to... I'm just having trouble connecting that, connecting those parts.
I do feel like Stephen King is making an interesting point about everyone's subconscious and everyone's inspiration sort of coming from different places. And, Stephen King is obviously a super kind of unorthodox writer. And maybe that's his comment on like, even down to my inspiration, it looks different than other authors. But I don't know. I thought it was interesting. I'm not sure what to take from it, but I just thought it was funny and interesting.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I was about to launch into some, I don't know, heady interpretation of what it actually means, but I think probably best to keep forward motion here. So the latter half of this, well, I guess there's a couple of parts. One is about how you want to deal with your subconscious and how to make that most useful for you. Some of what we've already touched on with sleeping. And then further on, it's just about how to brainstorm, like just very specific tips about how to brainstorm. So right. I think maybe we can pick a couple of interesting points from those two sections. One of the things that stood out to me in this chapter is, again, kind of the expansiveness that Shell is bringing to the table here, where he's talking about how you need to introspect your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, your dreams. And it's like, and it made me think of, it called to mind this quote from Carl Sagan, which is, to create an apple pie from scratch, you first need to invent the universe. And I may be misstating that quote, but it almost feels like Jesse Shell is saying, to create a game from scratch, like you first need to observe the whole universe, both extrinsic, intrinsic. He's talking about, you need to go on a soul journey to India to like and to so that you can make a truly innovative game. And then also like while you're doing that, you need to look at all of the internal content of your mind, and only then will you have a truly kind of well informed game.
Yeah, and I like the concept. I mean, I've always felt like creative pursuits are so broad, like they're so informed. You know, if you're a creator, or you're writing a book, or you're designing a game or something, everything that you do is informed by everything you've ever experienced, everything that you're, you know, reading at that time, like the games that you're playing at that time. So it really is this, I mean, creativity is this crazy thing where it's just truly holistic and informed by everything. So I think that's partially coming through in this chapter.
Yeah, I definitely want to. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about this. I feel like sometimes I am too influenced on recency of experiences. Things that are happening to me in the recent past are affecting how I'm viewing everything. But I would much more prefer to hold on to ideas that I think are good.
Yeah.
Right? I shouldn't, just because they're old doesn't mean they're not good ideas, and they shouldn't be impacting how I'm thinking about things. So I would like a system in my life where I'm able to continuously refine. It's not just whatever happens to be my influences in the last, I don't know, 6 months or a year or what have you. It's the influences that I really feel like are high quality.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to think of a way of how I can encapsulate that in a way that I can continue to just improve. And when I get a new thing, when I get a new piece of information, I can kind of look through the framework that I've already established and I've been honing.
Yeah.
And I can just fit it in, as opposed to just throw everything else I've been thinking out away, throw my prior thinking about everything away and just be like, oh, like this person has figured it all out, and I adopt everything that this person is saying, which I feel like is my current pattern.
I think that this is something that's so difficult, especially today. Like, it's something that's getting harder and harder just because there's so much content, and the quality bar for that content is, decently high. I mean, there's obviously a ton of garbage out there, but there's a lot of decent content out there. So it's really difficult to actually go back in time and maybe watch some older films or something. I've always believed that there's only one or two good ideas per year or so. If you're talking about like any given genre, like music, for instance, I think there's maybe like a few good albums per year, and that's it. And everything else is basically trash and will become just completely, no one will ever pay attention to that stuff.
Relegated to the dustbin of history.
Exactly. But I just think with the way culture works these days, where everything is constantly in your face, everything is constantly moving forward, and, something great might come out, but it almost immediately gets forgotten about and people move on. I just think it's harder and harder to find those things that are great. And it's also harder and harder to like go back in time and really dig into a great artist. Like when I was a kid, I rented every single Akira Kurosawa movie and just watched them all. And I just cannot imagine myself doing that today. Like, first of all, it takes 1 billion hours. I just don't have that time. But there's also just so many things happening. It's harder to... it's almost like you need to ignore the constant fire hose of content of today and just kind of become a monk and I don't know, like almost unchain yourself from this like mass consumption.
The reality is that you need to decide. Someone needs to decide at some point, because either you do this just linear search through literally all of the content, which I don't even know how you would do that. It's like, all right, you just sort all the content by by alphabetically and just start watching from there. Or you need to have some sort of aggregated summary that is some function of what everyone else thought of it. And so, someone needs to decide. So I think even in your monk-based analogy, you still need to somehow make that decision.
Absolutely. It's also just, and I don't know, I feel like I could really get into the weeds on this conversation, but like, I think the very nature of creativity shifts with culture. Like right now we have like TikTok, for instance, where it's not about having some monumental creative statement. It's more about, a lot of imitation, a lot of like reliance on sort of existing tropes, like existing popular stuff, like existing popular music, for instance, and like doing a dance for that. It's also a lot of like, you need to put out what people are expecting, because you only have people's eyes for like a few seconds. So if you completely like defy expectations, they're just going to ignore it. So
I don't know. There was this incredibly unusual thing that I saw on TikTok that I saw via Twitter.
Yeah.
I don't use TikTok myself, but it was a woman who she's dressed up like she's kind of like a shabby version of Harley Quinn from Batman.
Okay, yeah.
And
the
she's singing
jester woman.
just the vowels. Yeah, the jester woman from Batman, essentially. She's singing just the vowels in order of What a Wonderful World. Like, it's a wonderful, like the song, like the Louis, or what is this?
Louis Armstrong?
Louis Armstrong. Yeah. I should dig it up. I'll stick it in the, like a link to some of it. It was one of the strangest things I've ever seen, and it was blowing
Nice.
up on TikTok. And it was very different from literally anything I've ever seen. And I think, I don't know, I think it can be easy, and I'm not saying this is the position you're taking, but I think it can be easy to like look at the new thing and say it's not creative. But I think there is a lot of creativity going on in the.
Yeah, and I guess that's definitely not what I'm trying to say. Like I would be the first to admit that I don't understand TikTok, so maybe some of that is coming across. But I don't think that there's a lack of creativity. I just think the creativity almost has to be like redefined. Like, you need to be creative in a completely different way.
Yeah.
Because creativity always exists within certain constraints, right? But
Yeah.
like TikTok is just one extreme version of that. I mean, you have 15 seconds. You have, you're probably going to have some music in the background. Like, it's probably going to have to be dynamic and kinetic, and I don't know. It's interesting. I'm certainly not dismissing it. I think there's probably a lot of value there.
Yeah, I think what is true, and I think maybe this is what you were getting at, is that it needs to be immediately engaging.
Right. Yeah, you can't do a slow burn in TikTok,
Yeah.
which it's fascinating. I mean, because I think slow burn can be a really powerful creative tool, and it's interesting to have like a huge medium where it's just not allowed. And
Yeah. That's that is the platform right now, as far as I can tell. Everything, even tech YouTubers and coders that's where they're doing new stuff. The new ones are putting their stuff. So.
Well, and just that format in general, like the micro story where it's a 15-second video, just that format is so pervasive on literally everything. And yeah, I think it is. I think you're right. It's easy to be an old man and be like, oh, like people need to think deeper, and this is too superficial or whatever. And yeah, I don't want to come across that way, because that's not what I believe. But I do believe that it's just very different than a lot of other forms of creativity that exists in the past. It brings up some interesting questions.
I did have one last point I wanted to make about this section. And I'll be brief about it, which he has a section called Don't Push Too Hard. And I think this is just mostly for me to remind myself that this is true, and like, you cannot force it, even as much as I like to try, and that sometimes you just gotta stop. I don't know. I just find this a really hard lesson to internalize.
Now, are you saying if a project isn't working, like drop it, or like is there specifics of what you're talking about?
I'm thinking about this more in on a micro scale, where you're trying to tackle a problem that is going to require some level of creativity, or like just cognitive function,
Yeah.
and you are just slamming your head against the wall, and you're for whatever reason you're like, I have to get this done tonight, and it's like, or today, or what have you, and it's just stupid. It's just not a good idea, because sometimes, your attention and creativity, and in this case this is like subconscious, so this is like slightly different, these are all finite resources.
Yeah.
And yeah, you can maybe train them up, and like if you can get good at some of these things, but at the end of the day, like there's a point where you're going to reach it, and you're just going to be struggling unproductively.
Yeah.
And
This is like, I was just going to say, this is something that I've gotten better at with experience, and it's kind of a know thyself type of thing, where there's other engineers that I've known in the past who can just really focus on a problem for 10 hours straight and like get it in. And I realized a couple of years ago that I'm just not that person. Like I can go pretty strong until about 3 p.m. But if I have not like solved the main problems by then, I've become a lot better at just, okay, I'm going to wait till tomorrow. I'm going to sleep on it.
Yeah.
And, I think it means that it's partially just me realizing that, I'm more like a slightly above average engineer. Because I think earlier in my career, I was much more focused on like, oh, this person is doing a much better job than I am. I need to really like work harder. But there's only so far that can take you. And it's good. It's obviously good to be like motivated and stuff. And I'm not, it almost sounds like I'm saying that people should just give up or whatever. But people should know their limitations. And this is something that I've gotten a lot better at. And it's actually, I think what I'm really saying is by knowing your limitations, you can create more scalable, long-term, productive practices.
Right, because otherwise you're just going to burn yourself out.
Yeah, which is something I used to do all the time. Like I would just work until way too late on a problem, not get anywhere, still have the same results that I have today, basically. And I'm not saying you're doing that, but it's definitely something I struggled with for a long time. I mean, I guess we've spent a long time on the early part of this chapter. Do you want to talk about brainstorming a little bit?
Yeah, let's get into brainstorming, and then and then we can touch. Well, this has been a long one. That's all right. But yeah, let's get into brainstorming.
Yeah, brainstorming I thought was really interesting, and I actually just had a big brainstorming session at work just before I read this chapter, unfortunately, because I thought I might have used some of the advice in this chapter. But a couple things that I thought were really interesting. The first thing is he didn't talk about he talks about so many different things, and I want to cover a lot of it, but like as far as I could tell, he didn't talk about like rating or prioritizing things. I guess he said number your lists.
But he's not. He doesn't take that to mean this is
better.
This implies an ordering. Yeah.
And I thought I wanted to discuss this because like that's always something I've done during brainstorming sessions is you come up with 50 ideas or whatever. And then towards the end, everyone votes on what their favorite idea is. And I've always seen that to be a valuable exercise. Like it's a good way to just get the temperature of the room, like what ideas people like. But he didn't mention that. I just thought that was interesting.
I think I think he's not suggesting you don't do what you did at the end, but I think in this section, it's just that first part, right? It's just the process to get to those 50 ideas.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to, when you're thinking out loud, I think it is important to separate the process of idea generation and idea validation. because I feel like sometimes there could be a bad idea that could be tweaked into a good idea. And
Oh
I
yeah.
think that this is what this is about.
Yeah, well, and that's where I think it's so important during these brainstorming sessions, and I think he says this, but like nothing is off the table for discussion where you might throw out ideas that seem completely insane, but to your point, you can either tweak them a little bit, you can workshop the idea, or it might inform some other idea that's like much more sane and actually a good idea at that point. So definitely a big fan of just when I just ran this brainstorming session at work, and one of my introductory points was like, this is a safe space. you
Yeah.
can talk about literally anything, even if an idea seems crazy. Like that's more
Let's
of a
get it
reason
all
to
out
bring it
there.
up. Yeah, let's get it out. I myself was throwing out like completely insane ideas, almost ideas that I knew were bad, and most of them were. But I think a few of them at least sparked a little bit of valuable conversation, and I really think that's important in a brainstorming environment.
Yeah, I think he puts it really succinctly where he says the best way to have a good idea is to have lots of ideas.
Yeah, totally. I completely agree with that. Yeah, the quantity over quality is extremely important to this exercise. He mentioned toys, which I I did not include in my brainstorming session, and I kind of regretted it after reading this chapter because I thought that was interesting.
What kind of toys would you bring to the table, literally, if you wanted people to have more productive ideas about how to refactor a large scale engineering backend?
It's a good question. Like, because I think toys can, serve so many purposes. Even just, I don't know. Like, I don't know. Do you have any ideas? What sort of toys?
Well,
you know,
the main idea that comes to mind would be that you have a physical representation of the system.
yeah,
And this gives you a way to, okay, let's just try to see what seems to be like a physically meaningful, because he talks about this a little bit in the he calls out the space remembers, where or in his one of his sections in brainstorming was called the space remembers, and it kind of almost is like this is a way to hack your brain, because humans are designed spatially, like design. I mean, they're not designed, but they have evolved to be good at these spatial tasks.
right.
So you should hack into that, and that will allow you to have better cognitive function in some ways. I don't know. It doesn't seem crazy to me that you might be able to see some relationships between these things if you are representing them physically. So
Totally.
I don't know. I
Yeah.
could see some, kind of like a connects kind of system where you have some way to, like, let's try to see how to compose these.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. Yeah. And I do think that could have helped a lot, is just having some more physical stuff. And this is something that's getting interesting in today's world, where something that's very important is remote work.
Yeah.
Like when I was running the brainstorming session, there was a group of people who were remote. And I think it made it interesting. There were certain things that we couldn't do. Like we couldn't write note cards on a whiteboard, for instance. We couldn't even really write on a whiteboard because the people that are remote obviously can't do that. So it definitely made it interesting to have some of those limitations. But I don't know. I think it also made it, there was things that we were able to do that would have been a lot harder. Like, for instance, there was points where we got into little mini rooms. We just broke into little mini groups. And that was way easier with people being remote, where we could just literally break up the video conference into like smaller groups.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought it just presented some interesting limitations.
All right. Yeah, so I think we can wrap this up. One parting thought I would say is I almost want to throw everything away that we already have. because the whole point of this is idea generation. And maybe we don't need to throw absolutely all of it away, but I want to do this process. I want to do what he's saying.
Yeah.
And maybe we can even get in the same room. I'm going to get a whiteboard in here. So we can do this in the physical space. We write everything down. I think, I even think we could have a whole episode that's all about idea generation.
I love it.
So I think let's do that, because that's the spirit of what the season is supposed to be about, is really going through the paces.
Yeah.
That
sounds super fun. Let's definitely do that.
All right. Well, I'll talk to you later, John.
See you later, Matt.